Sound, when I think about it, it feels so natural. It took so long to discover it for myself or let it discover me. And but it feels so natural and it makes sense because I think about it as space
Mm-hmm.
and material.
Mm-hmm.
And it is that gray area. It's that thickness
Yeah.
that's surrounding us. And I think in my practice, whatever mediums I worked with, I was always interested in that space.
Welcome, everyone. This is Victoria Vesna, and you're listening to Vibrations Matter. In this episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Sholeh Asgary, an artist of Iranian heritage whose work explores complex themes through a poetic, immersive experience. Sholeh approaches sound as a sculptural material, something to be shaped, molded, and experienced physically, inviting her audience to be fully enveloped within it. She reflects in our discussion on how her childhood, marked by geographic displacement, shaped her fluid sense of place and identity. This movement and adaptability are deeply embedded in her artistic process, which is rooted in building relationships between past and present, space and audience, memory and perception. In her installations, sound becomes both architecture and connective tissue. It links concept, aesthetic, and narrative into a resonant, unified experience. Sholeh's work invites us to listen with our whole bodies, to dwell in the aura of sound as presence. Enjoy. All right, Sholeh. So nice to have you here and talk to you. And I have the carpet in my background, which is something that I really wanted because I remembered that the moment of us sitting around the carpet with the light, with the sound in your latest piece that you did for the Getty PST project really is memorable, a moment for me as a kind of a way of us gathering in this space that's like in the nanosystems with all the noise. And we still were managed to find this little space, and the light was like this warm hearth, and just you talking about your grandfather and your ancestry really made me want to ask you to go back in time and tell us about moments in your childhood or those early kind of light bulb events that just kind of made you feel like, I want to go in this direction. I want to find out more about my family history and how it influenced your thinking and, in general, your relationships in this world and the sound.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Also, thank you for having me, for
Of
bringing me
course.
into this whole amazing program that's been really inspiring in so many ways. And I feel fortunate or honored that my exhibition was the one that we close on, and that it resonated with all the sort of challenges that are existing and such.
Hmm.
And I think that's a part, that's a part of it as well, right? We work with what we have and what we can, and the building, right? Being loud, like place becomes a part of how we interact and how we contextualize, right, ourselves and our relationships. But gosh, to go way back, let's see. I mean, I talk about my piece as being somewhat time travel-y, but on a more kind of biographical, personal note. Gosh, what can I remember? Okay, so I think a few formative moments for me, and I'm kind of taking this very broadly and generally, so they may be formative in very different directions and such. Um, so one thing I remember, and I think it was when we first came to the States. I was born in Iran, and Um, it was, gosh, and there's of course, certain things that I will share and certain things I will um not, but
How old were you when you arrived?
by the time we got into the States in Houston, I don't know. I think I was between 2 to 3 years old.
I see.
We left
Really young.
on when I was several months old. I have photos to prove it because I can't remember it, but I remember the photos. But I turned a year old in Paris.
Mm.
Um,
Wow.
we went to a million, we, went to a million meeting forcibly in many ways. We were not planning to come to the States. We actually weren't planning to leave Iran either.
Wow.
So we all of this. I was really born into a very kind of insane moment and with a lot of activity and a lot of trauma, ongoing trauma that I wouldn't really understand like the words to it until I was older.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so some of these things are the things that I'll kind of limit talking about within our
Sure.
and such, but which some of them maybe, yeah, we've spoken about. But it wasn't, so I think it was a few years old. We were in the States. I arrived, I mean, I had a lot of allergies and infections because we'd just been like all over and deported to like a million places. And so my speech wasn't perfect either. Like I
Mm.
remember losing a spelling contest in the playground and I don't know, preschool because everyone thought I spelled dog with a T and no one could understand. And I was like, no, it's
Oh.
Tog. And I
Oh.
see. And and there was like this really deep rooted sense of being completely misunderstood.
Mm.
Like I'm there and I'm speaking, but no one can actually hear me or understand me. And, at some point it's like, I guess I'm gonna just have to sit with this. I know that I said it correctly, or I said, spelled it correctly. So, there are, I think, these kinds of relationships to speech and
Yes.
speaking in
Yes.
some ways, that, and also the sort of misunderstanding, also adapting to, I mean, I was a kid, so English is my first language, but when we came to the States, I was speaking in Farsi and French. And, but also, um, yeah, language seemed to have some limits to me, and not only audibly or in the way that I could kind of say words, but just in other ways as well. I do
Hmm.
remember, so maybe two moments and maybe a third will emerge, but one was I remember sometime when I was 3, there was a mini piano. I think we were at someone's home and they had one of those little child pianos. And I remember just falling in love. And I even created a song in those 10 minutes that I still remember and I still sometimes play, and it was all minor keys. Or
Wow. Amazing.
I don't know my music
Amazing.
keys. It was like
All the black keys.
all the black keys, yeah. And so I still remember that, and I still remember that song, and there's even a photo, and the photo is so affirming because there's just this like lightness and brightness in my eyes. Um, and so that was one thing. I was always very creatively inclined in a family of, they were students, they were going to med school, going to nursing school. We were struggling to get by. They were studying or working. Like we'd literally go, in Texas, like we'd go and sell shrimp on the side of the highway. Dad, so that he could pay to go to school. And,
Wow.
and
And
eventually
Texas, what a place to land.
what a place to land. I did not stay there long. My mom and I got out of there, but like pretty quickly. I think it was just such a shock for my mom.
Yeah, I
But
can
my dad,
imagine.
my dad stayed there for like 40 years and or 30 years. So it was, yeah, it was what a place to land. And, it wouldn't be, I think, until maybe high school that I remember some family members just left Iran, and they were basically let out of prison after 8 years and in solitary confinement. And she's
Mm.
a deeply inspirational aunt. And immediately they, family found a way to fly her out to
Wow.
Canada, because of course, like the US was even harder. And I remember at that point, I was probably like 16, I don't remember, 14, 15. So, suddenly like everyone's gathered around and there's no hiding or suppressing, right? The fact
That's
that
right.
she was let out of prison and where she'd been all those 8 years, and also finally gets to like see her son, who's my age,
Wow.
and that moment in those gatherings, it's the communication started to open up, and I began to learn bit by bit about our background and about things. Because up until then, I mean, I always felt like an outsider, right? I was always kind of, as a kid growing up in these places, feeling like, oh, why isn't my name Heather? And why do my parents have an accent? Why does our food smell this way? And so it was, a very active kind of me as a kid wanting to push back and kind of being like, wait, why isn't my family into assimilation? And I was like, well, duh, because they're like, like Marxists and such, or they were, and or Lenin. And so that was that moment of kind of opening, and it was a larger intergenerational, I would say, reckoning to some extent, where there was language
Hmm.
that was accessible to me and shared rather than shielding me from about these experiences that for me didn't have words. It was like I was just this alien that just fell from the sky and I was suddenly here, and sometimes we'd move there. And that opened up a lot for me. But I think like in that interim, in that whole process, there was so much of the sort of gray area, the sort of multiple felt realities in truths that are lived in my interactions with the world and with people. That those sort of a little bit more concrete words and experiences and kind of lineages came to be later. And so I'm not sure if this totally answers your question, but I think that was really formative in terms of how both that kind of being hidden from me or protected, shielding me from it, and then learning about it, but um, and also the whole process, right, of how I would kind of interact with the world. I think I guess what I'm saying is I think these actually shaped um I almost want to say like more metaphorically, like a large gray area mass in my head.
No, absolutely. I mean, as you're talking, I'm visualizing the small piano and also the kind of struggle between culture and language and different sounds, right? And so the piano is a song, but the language is the, conflict of,
Yeah.
and resolving that is really what the work is about, right? And then finding out, wait, my strength is in my lineage and my ancestry. It's not something that I should be ashamed of, which is what, a lot of societies create, that kind of shame or push away the things that really make up our diversity.
Hmm.
So it explains a lot to me, actually. It's definitely an answer. It's a beautiful answer.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how you then started moving towards the arts and
Yeah.
creating that kind of melting and bringing it into your work in a very poetic way and very site specific and in a way that's not preachy or didactic,
Yeah.
really brings people in to ask, like, what is this about?
Thank you. Yeah, I would attribute that to that large gray mass. It's
Yes.
been really strengthened and developed in my mind because, for me, it was, seeking certainty was not in my experience,
Right.
and in my kind of like, there was no such thing.
Lucky, because it's the way it is.
Yeah, it's the way it is.
And now it's like, what an asset, because
Totally
nobody
what an
has
asset,
certainty.
right? Yeah. I'm just like, what's wrong, folks? No, it's always been like this.
Exactly.
Uh,
Welcome to my world.
yeah, totally. Like you can now be free. But yeah, I think that's a huge, huge part of it. Uh yeah, that's a big part of it, I think, is not just that was such a normal way of being. Also, I think culturally, historically, right, experientially too, there's a lot of things that you can't say.
Right.
Right? And so there's, censorship and repression and dictatorship and all these things and, imprisonment and trauma, they'll, you find ways to communicate and connect, and they're not in the most obvious ways that might appeal to a grant panel, you know,
Right, right.
and, um, and so
For
that's,
instance.
yeah, for instance. So, like, that's something that I'm actually, have had to learn in more recent years is like, actually, no, these things aren't obvious, right? To me, it's so obvious in the work and in certain things, but not, not for others or other reasons. So I think, uh, yeah, I would attribute like a lot of it to that. In terms of, I think, I feel like I had no other choice of living a life that was or seeking a life that was in line with my curiosities and my creativity. I really don't think I would have had another option in some ways. I think I would be a very miserable person. And
Probably, like a lot of people are, right?
yeah, yeah. I don't think I would be good at masking it, or even good at getting by. And
Lucky.
yeah, so it's great, right? I don't really quite have that option, but I've also had the support to, I've had the support from family who aren't in the arts, but knowing that expression and that these modes of knowledge making and connection and research and activity are just as vital as perhaps their medical professions or other things. I'm really, really fortunate to have that support because I think a lot of people don't, and
That's right.
a lot
That's
of
right.
people have to undo that. And
Especially as a female artist, right? And and that culture and in our culture too, but it's pretty extreme
oh yeah,
in that culture. So you were so fortunate.
I was so fortunate that I actually rebelled against it when it was,
They allowed you so much freedom.
yeah, yeah. Don't get me wrong, they were strict as hell. But I still managed to pretty much be absent for half of high school. If I wasn't in the dark room, I was at the beach in Santa Monica and
Wow.
doing that whole thing. But it was yeah, and I actually rebelled against it. But I think, part of it, and I understand now as I'm older, why I rebelled against it. Like let's say when I was younger, and then even when I would say like in my early schooling, like an undergrad in the early 2000s and up until graduate school, which was 2009, I also, I think, kind of I think it was a protective mechanism. So,
Mhm.
I think that rebelling when I was younger was also just like when I look back in hindsight, I think there were other parts of myself that needed to develop.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking. You were developing, you were creating your own space, your own shield in a way. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and protecting that,
Exactly.
letting it
Exactly.
become a task, right? That someone else is like, well, you didn't practice this for 1 hour.
Right.
I went through that with piano and that didn't last long. I was like, I don't want to play Beethoven anymore. And and anyhow, so but and then I think later on in my undergrad, it was also so much about de-internalizing certain things and understanding the power, right, of of who I am and my experiences and all that I've inherited, as opposed to it being something that's getting in my way, And I think that in early years of schooling and foundational kind of like undergrad and such, I think it was also an aspect of protecting myself from how I'm identified, right, as an Iranian artist. And
Exactly.
so I really
Exactly.
push back against that. And I really think of it as like, well, yeah, I don't in a way want to feed myself to the wolves. And I need to understand how, yeah, how I move through creatively and in a
Hmm.
practice, rather than feeling like it's some kind of a thing, it sounds extreme, but it feels that way. That's like preyed upon
Yes.
in
Yeah.
a way. So I think it kind of, when I look back, it's like, well, yeah, maybe I was stubborn, but also there was a reason there, to do that. But yeah, and I think. kind of to the creative aspect of it, this was a place where I could, this was a place where I felt comfortable to exist in metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
I could explore abstraction and not just abstraction in this kind of like, right, postmodern kind of like, or whatever modern sense, but in abstraction of how abstracted certain violences can feel in our everyday life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
um, so yeah, and so right, eventually to me it felt I had a hard time with certain words. I had a hard time with images because I began with photography, actually photojournalism. Architecture was my first major, and then it was photojournalism. But I had a hard time with images as well because I felt that there were places where it failed us in a lot of ways, and I wasn't really ready to, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
wrangle that.
So how did sound come into all of this as a kind of a connecting thread, right? That pulled everything together, I'm imagining.
It took me so long to find sound. And sound, when I think about it, it feels so natural. It took so long to discover it for myself or let it discover me. And but it feels so natural and it makes sense because I think about it as space
Mm-hmm.
and material.
Mm-hmm.
And it is that gray area. It's that thickness
Yeah.
that's surrounding us. And I think in my practice, whatever mediums I worked with, I was always interested in that space, but through different words or mediums or whatever that I understood. So, it was really having access to some sonic tools being around me
Mm-hmm.
is what really just set it off.
And really, I imagine that it took a while because you were having to free yourself from Beethoven and from what
Oh,
was
I
told to
tried
you
that
as.
long ago.
But I mean, as it still ingrains, I know because I had a similar experience, and it ingrains in you what is sound or music, and you have to really figure out your own way to find your own vibration, your own sound, and where you have that space, right? That doesn't follow necessarily those Western canons of music, really.
Yeah, well, that's something that I find myself more recently indirectly reckoning with, especially through voice. I'll say I was a horrible piano student. And this
Well,
was
that's why
really, I
you
just,
were rebelling.
yeah, this it didn't last until like past junior high, and I was, yeah, I was horrible. And so when I discovered sound, it was literally because I don't really read notes in a very outside of a basic way, but it began with such a material physical engagement. And I think that gave me the direct access. So I never began my entry with sound thinking about music,
Right, exactly.
about
Exactly.
material properties and how these material properties exist in a sound environment. So it was, from contact mics and loops and random objects and doing that over and over again and just creating these kinds of spaces
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
actually originally for me to then do other artwork within.
Right. So
um
give us an example.
oh my gosh, so gosh, what was it? I remember being in Montreal for 4 months. We were in this wonderful, we had some artist friends out there. It was Thomas Beijing, who's this incredible artist and sound artist in Montreal. It's no longer, it was, I think, in the Miles End area, but he ran Super Studios. And we were there for about 4 months in a studio and just, um, it was fantastic. And, there was access and community support to it. And I think, oh yeah, somehow I came, oh yeah, it was like a 99-cent store plastic chicken. It's not very, yeah, it was like literally a plastic chicken. And it was like, what happens if I contact mic it? What happens if I release this chicken 20 times? What happens if I loop it? What happens if I drive my studio mates crazy? Had them for 4 hours and like, okay, that's enough, please. And so it was really just these through these material engagements or, finding discarded objects and putting contact mics on them. So playing a piano, not like a piano, but is a rhythmic kind of element through the wood,
Mm-hmm.
resonance
Mm-hmm.
frame. It was literally through those kinds of things. And I think early on, I also realized that voice was such an instrument and I wanted to explore voice as well. And this is where that undoing or just realizing that, that's a part of me comes from, which you alluded to earlier. Um, so I was for a few years, I was trading with this incredible, brilliant Iranian vocalist, Masa Vahdat, who has deep knowledge of all the sort of like the classics and such in the Persian tradition. And I thought that I thought that I'd understand the different, we call it like dastor. So they're sort of like the different, gosh, I don't want to butcher this, not scales, but anyhow, I thought I would be a little bit better at that. And it was after a year or two, I realized, gosh, my
This is so
ear.
complicated.
Yeah, because I realized how tuned my ear is to Western music. And it was really difficult, because I thought, oh, this is going to help me kind of get back to this and understand this. And it really just opened up how
Hmm.
wide that kind of distance is from, like, let's say the homeland. And, it's an entire life that's lived um, that has not, the conditions have not changed to be able to go back. And this is how it is. And at this point,
Right.
my ear is tuned, there's aspects of me that are like physiologically detuned and tuned elsewhere. And so that's where a lot of the reckoning for me came from is realizing that. And so a lot of questions come up for me is like, okay, how much of that do I actively work against and how much of that do I also push into
Right.
in
Right.
some ways? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the Western music in the last couple of 100 years has been kind of detuned.
Yeah.
Uh, So we all know that, and you were pushing against that. So it really is a kind of a metaphor for what you were struggling with, and the
Mhm.
sound and the compositions that were kind of forced and that became part of your system because you were in that environment, which brings me to site specific work that you do. And what I liked when you were setting up your installation is that you embrace the space with all its issues. And we've seen many different people respond to it differently, especially people working with sound. They're like, oh my God, it's so noisy here. I'm trying to get away from it. And you were like, okay, it's noisy. Let's see what we can do with this. And
Yeah.
I thought, okay, she's really working with sound.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm not gonna lie, it was a challenge. I definitely did have that moment when I came in and I was like,
Sure.
this is even louder than I remember it.
Yes.
And
Yeah. Yeah. It's like
um,
they're trying to push us out with the sound. What
yeah,
are these artists doing in this Nanosystems Institute?
totally. I'm like, okay, I'll take this as an invitation to just get louder with you and to work with you since I can't push into the subtleties of getting to.
Right.
But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think like if I were to weave something too from that kind of like upbringing and those early experiences is, like the silence and the non-silence, right? And the verbalized and the non-verbalized and the intonations in one voice. I may not understand all of vocabulary in Farsi, I don't, and or even in English, but you understand intonations
Right.
and hear and feel even more so, right, from someone's cadence or an intonation, like what that emotional topography is or what's being said, sometimes in the actual word. And I think about this, if I were to bridge it from there, in some ways also true of spaces, right? Um, and yeah, coming to the CNSI gallery, it was very, very loud, and I realized immediately that this is what I'm working with. And if I'm going to respond site specifically, there's I need to actually, because the piece
Right.
behind you, Ganon, it's it's not totally a site specific piece, but it needs to be tuned, right? It's essentially
That's right.
tuned
That's
to
right.
a space. And so it's actually kind of exciting, right? To sort of allow oneself to discover, what does this need to be tuned to? What does
Mhm.
it need to be in this space? And how do I kind of how am I responsive to that while maintaining the integrity of what the piece is, but through an adaptation or through a response to the space? So that became so clear. And it did involve the addition of a subwoofer and and super large bass amplifier. And but that's what it needed to respond to the space. And so for me it became more about, okay, there are the subtleties and the water being transduced through the piece, but this becomes also about kind of bringing like contouring, the shapes of what we hear in this
Mhm.
environment, right? Of this larger machine.
Yes.
That's,
Yes.
we're literally in the belly of this beast.
Yes.
How do we create a space of gathering here, and without hiding, those contours? And that sound does actually feel kind of violent. It feels,
Hmm.
intrusive, and there are histories of the building, and all of these things that actually are, uh but also there's tones in it.
That's right.
There's a lot of also beautiful tones. And so, yeah, it was interesting for me because the piece to me became something that was like kind of veering on the edge of unbearable.
Which is kind of the times we live in.
Yeah, totally.
On the edge of unbearable.
Yeah, at the edge. And it's like, this is what we're working with, and
That's,
we can't turn away from it, and we should look at it.
that's right. Straight in the face.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So talk about your use of breath. You talked about voice and sound, but I was struck by you explaining how you were breathing into those prints. And just in general, you don't even have to necessarily refer to those pieces. Just this idea of breathing in to materiality, I found very interesting, and I wouldn't have caught that if you didn't describe it. So I think it's important for you to put that out.
Yeah. Yeah, with the breathing with that piece, it's yeah, I mean, there's so much to be said about breath. I think with that piece, breath became my access point. I think much as in some of my practice, voice has become
Right.
access point to lineages and kind of histories, and in the histories of specific regions of land and
Mm-hmm,
such,
mm-hmm.
through a very embodied practice. Breath is, part and parcel of that. And I think as you're posing this question to me, I'm thinking of it now. I'm like, well, yeah, it makes sense that breath became the action that created, in some ways, right, the marks on the paper. And with that piece with Hotel, I have no idea how I came about breath, but it felt so natural, right? And I think with these pieces, it's, I do so much research, and I exhaust the research on pieces, whether it's about the ganots and the waterways, or about use of sound and controlling and surveying populations, or yeah, or like, the ganot diggers and such. I then cast that all aside after I've exhausted it, and I just work really, really intuitively and look at what's around me, you know? What do I have to work with? And that also includes my body and my experience and my intuition. And so with that piece, breath became a way for me to create craters in plaster with which to then fill with melted water bottles, which from the and then those, I cast those molds, and from that I then embossed cotton rag paper as a sort of very intuitive mapping of the waterways from an aerial view, after also spending hours and days or weeks kind of studying them on Google Maps through, right, like drone and this and that, because that's what's accessible. But I think in this way, the breath perhaps becomes, yeah, it is like an exchange. It's an exchange, and I felt in a way like it was a tribute to the lineages of, my family, my grandfather who would dig the waterways, and thinking about the sort of the fragility of breath when you're doing an occupation such as mining.
Right,
But
right.
but also thinking about perhaps these larger kind of tectonic breaths on the
Hmm.
landscape through time in a very not just intergenerational human kind of way, but in a much larger way when thinking about climate and thinking about these sort of these different, yeah, markings on the lands that become visible only, whether it's after spending hours in the studio or after millennia.
It's true. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's I mean, we could be breathing air that was from millennia ago, right? It's all, who knows
We're definitely
what's,
going to be breathing a lot,
oh, well,
a
we're
lot more
certain.
of that with climate. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So, what about the pieces that were outside? You have some site-specific pieces that are in the public.
Yeah.
How do you approach that when it's related to sound, and what attracts people to it, and what experience you want to give them? Because public art can a lot of times just kind of stay with the aesthetic,
Yeah.
and that's sad. But, but I was looking at your work and I thought, oh, this is interesting. It's actually trying to engage the public in a different way.
Yeah.
So maybe you can speak to that a little bit. Your work moves through different kind of environments and adjusts to it, just like you did, shaping yourself. So you're very pliable, both as a person and with your work, and not judgmental, like, okay, this is where we landed, so what do we have here?
Yeah. And I'm trying to hold on to that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
The more
It's a
you,
gift.
thank you. I mean, the more you learn and the more you research and the more you make or the more you discover, right? It's easier to
Of
move
course,
from
it's a
that. And
gift.
thanks. And so, yeah, also an exercise to maintain. I think, with site-specific pieces, so thinking about Ghost Winds, which is the sort of English title of the piece, this was a six-channel parametric sound piece that was originally installed at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts' outdoor sculpture courtyard with a large
Hmm.
sculpture. We're actually installing a three-channel version of it right now outdoors in Berkeley.
Oh, nice,
Yeah,
nice.
and I think with this piece, so okay, so one of the things when I was installing this piece, for example, right, this is parametric speakers, right? One could be standing 5 inches to the left and not hear a thing, right?
That's right.
And so thinking about this large sculpture garden area, when I was putting this whole piece together, I recall one of my mentors, Louis DeSoto, telling me something that his mentor had told him, a sound artist, and which was, oh, he says things so much more poetically, beautifully, but it was something along the lines that it brought to my mind of like, how does one orchestrate an environment?
Mm.
So to lead people to discover it, right? Because I think I was really walking the line of a piece potentially not even being discovered because you're not standing in the right position. And so I think, but this really stuck with me because I think that is my work has been developing some of the pieces. In some ways, I think of them as sort of refusing to perform for the public. They're pieces, that are kind of watching you.
Yes,
They
yes.
require the viewer to do work, right? It's not didactic. It's not, if I move my hand, the thing's going to go like this.
Right, right,
And
exactly.
so and I think that's something that I also value in how I approach things, but something I also have to be very careful of because I just have such, sometimes an attitude of like, well then, you know,
Sorry.
yeah, sorry, like this is great. It's the most obscure thing.
Nobody
But it's
heard
the most
it, so
meaningful.
what?
Yeah, it's like, well, what's okay? It could be the most meaningful thing and obscure, but if it's not connecting and there aren't entry points, then what am I really doing? Why am
Exactly.
why do I want to share it? And so I think with that being said, it does become such a delicate kind of finding that line of, providing just the right
Mhm.
amount of entry points that are multi-layered. It could be a conceptual entry point. It could be a material entry point. It could be a very political entry point, and all of these exist with the piece. I kind of forgot your question.
You answered it. You
Oh,
answered it beautifully, actually, by your mentor's idea of orchestrating the
yeah,
sound in public space. It just comes back to what you said earlier about the materiality of sound and really sculpturing with sound. Uh, I think that's really evident in your work, and the parametric speakers allow for that because you're actually figuring out. I've done some work with it, and it's pretty amazing, actually. It's so delicate is the word, because
yeah,
you're like on a tightrope. Where is this going to actually work? So you are sculpting with space, but you're sculpting with listening. In
yeah.
other words, like you said, it's not the interactivity that's, cause and effect. It's more like you're moving through space and discovering edges of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think in discovering relationships, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's
Exist,
right.
such as yeah, and these relationships are related to the politics of a place or of a space. And
And the element of surprise, so that you don't really know what's going to happen, so you start kind of searching through it, which is
yeah.
also a very nice thing to do. But it's a craft. I really see shaping with sound, especially in a public space
Mm,
where it's not expected and you get audiences from every walk of life. So it's not like you're getting, experts in sound that are going to respond to it. Maybe one or two walks in, but it could be a kid. You want to have everyone feel it, right? The
yeah.
materiality of sound.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's what's to me so engaging about it. It's a
Yeah,
way
yeah.
it's so relational
Hmm.
and I find it to be so engaging in the way that it engages others because it's a material. And I think that sometimes, I've heard things about, I don't know, from maybe certain curators like, oh, her work is like very conceptual. It's not accessible or something. It's like it's actually so accessible. It's a material engagement with place and
It's the opposite actually, because it's not accessible to people who expect a certain format and certain parameters. Okay, fine, right? But if you break through those parameters and allow the public to come in outside of the white cube, right? The white cube of expectations, I should say, then, because nothing wrong with the white cube.
no, but yeah, when you push outside of that and
Yes.
you actually interrogate that, it's exciting. So I remember when I was installing at YBCA, oh my gosh, the 2 days that we were installing, there was, oh my God, on that one day, noisiest corner, there was a presidential motorcade.
Oh my goodness. That's
And there
a,
was a protest in response.
oh.
And then sometime later, there was a totally unrelated, a high-speed chase.
Wow. Wow.
And, it was just hilarious, but I was also thinking, like, this is so perfect.
Yes. Yeah.
Because,
It really is kind of saying what's happening in the whole space, right? And how it will be intruded on. And that's part of it.
Yeah, and I'm kind of maybe one of those intruders as well. And, and so what does it mean to intrude upon, an institutional space like, the museum or YBCA? And what does it mean to intrude upon like a street corner that's public, but that's also governed in certain ways, right? Like
Right, right.
what what does intrusion mean in these different ways? And I think it's complicated, and that's kind of what I'm here for. And I think that sound is just such an immediate physical relationship that we have that allows that. We're so developed as an image society.
Yes,
We're
yes,
overly developed and saturated, and sound is the most, one of the, it's the most innate thing to us. It's we feel it. I would say like we're in the womb and we're surrounded by darkness and water, in sound and in vibrations, and but yet, right, it's a little harder for us to talk about these things in a larger kind of society, right? And I always tell my students, I'm like, when you hear something, how it makes you feel. You know exactly how it makes you feel, and you have very sharp opinions about it. Um, like we're so experienced with it, right? It's a
yes,
tactile
yes.
thing, and so I think you know, infusing some of that back, or just kind of, I don't know, pointing us towards uh maybe certain conditions around us, and
And really, in the end, pointing people to listen, even to each other, because there's so much judgment and bias happens from the visual, right?
yeah,
And and we have been trained on the visual, which is such a narrow, narrow band in the sense world, and it's delayed. So I'm so excited that it's coming back and that there's more and more students, artists, young artists really who are engaging in it, even if they're in the visual arts programs. It's just very exciting to me because I feel like maybe part of it, not maybe, but part of it will be that we will listen to each other. And that is what's missing, that kind of feeling. And listening doesn't necessarily mean words, and also means all kinds of other things, as we know.
yeah.
So it's just great listening to you.
Oh,
And I guess I would like to just end by asking you, where do you see going with sound? Because you're kind of at a new intersection. You're going to a new environment, new job. You're going to land in a different place, which
yeah.
is going to, maybe you're anticipating something that will happen, or maybe you don't know. You're just going to be open to it. But certainly, from understanding your path of how you were landing in different places and responding to it, I can see you also really blossoming in a different direction, with all, of course, the experiences that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Where do
Thank
you see it going? I'm curious.
I'm very excited. Thank you. I'm very excited. I see it developing further. I have some projects in my mind that I'm really excited to start working on. And I think that the sort of the non-didactic aspect of my work and the maybe opaqueness of it, I think as we continue through these right, like times will, maybe feel more accessible to some in a larger
Yes,
way. I mean, it already is, but in a layered way, yeah, in terms of a different political kind of access or understanding of that, of not being so direct, but being so direct at the same
right.
time, and pointed with that. I'm really excited. I think that I will, I mean, my background began in the visual arts, and I began working with sound, and I think it was like 2017 or 2015 or so. And so I'm usually splitting my time in the art studio, where I also work with maybe like, my sound sculptures and installations, but also in the music studio. And so it's, and more recently, I've just really gone fully into the music studio, and I think even more into sound. So I'm very excited. It's hard to say. I think everything you've said really wonderful and I'm affirmative. And I'm excited you see that too, because it really affirms
I see
how
it
I feel.
completely. And I see also these two studios merging.
It would be so nice because right now I can be loud in the music studio and I can be messy in the art studio.
Right. You
And
want to
they are in
bring that
different
together.
locations. And so, yes, I think as I move and get more
Yes.
support, they can come into the same space. And there's definitely more albums and performances. But I think I'm really excited into getting into more aspects of uh, engineering certain things. I have a project that's with wind fans, and I'm really excited about
Nice.
militarization and somehow generating maybe second order beats from multiple wind fans that are pitched in
Well,
different.
there you go. So you have to have it in one room.
They need to be in one room. It's going to be windy and loud.
I like that the winds will bring it together. The karmic winds will just do its thing.
Well, they do its thing, and I just have to, sometimes you have to get out of our own way and
Yes,
um,
exactly.
go where
Exactly.
that is. And I think having
That's
that research support is tremendous, and not only kind of developing that, but also fostering that.
wonderful. So good to talk to you. I've learned so much, and I keep thinking of that little piano that you discovered.
Later on, I'll find a photo of me.
Oh, you
You can
should.
just see
Absolutely.
the
We're gonna
glow
put
in
it
my
in.
eyes when I discovered it, and I think that's come back since I
Yeah.
discovered sound on my terms.
Beautiful.
And in
Beautiful.
the grayness of it all. But really, Victoria, thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh,
And
thank you for taking the time to talk and share the kind of larger picture of what informs your work. It's just really wonderful. I feel like I know you better. I
oh,
appreciate you better. And I really, really wish you so much luck in pulling these worlds together and creating all kinds of magical, wonderful experiences for
thank
us
you
all.
so well. You're deeply inspiring, so I feel
Thank you.
really fortunate. Thank you.
Okay.
Right.